Hi guys, we're going to start off with an image from 1949. I'm going to reveal more and more of it, try to figure out what these people are looking at before I remove the top part of the image. If it helps, these are Berliners. In other words, these are people from Berlin. They're looking up into the sky, trying to figure out what it is. Now that is an American plane. If you think about an American plane flying over Berlin in 1944 or 1945, it's going to be dropping bombs. But this is 1949, World War II is long over. These are American planes dropping off supplies to feed the people of Berlin. So these Berliners are joyous to be seeing an American plane in their skies for once. This leads us on to one of the most tense moments in the early part of the Cold War. It's a dramatic title for a dramatic period. How did post-war Berlin decide the fate of Europe? Now, I've got a stretch and challenge quote, which we're going to come back to at the end of the lesson. It's attributed to Vladimir Lenin, who was the first communist leader of the Soviet Union. He who controls Berlin controls Germany. He who controls Germany controls Europe. So think about that as we go through this lesson. Think how far that would be true in the 1940s. Is it even true today still? Now here we have a map of Germany, or at least what Germany should have been after World War II if its borders hadn't changed. But you might remember from the Potsdam Agreement, there were many agreements made about the future of Germany. One of them was that Poland would be shifted westward. So the Soviet Union took part of Poland and Poland took part of Germany. So the size of Germany is massively reduced, looking something a bit more like this. Also, Germany split up into 4 zones: the Soviet Union, America, France, and Britain. But even on top of that, the Berlin capital is split into 4 as well. Even though it was deep in the heart of the Soviet territory, Britain, France, and America were worried about the idea of the Soviet Union controlling the capital city. After all, the capital is the area which controls the most important people, the most important businesses and buildings. So if you control the capital city, you have a much greater influence over the country as a whole. So that's what Berlin looked like. You can see the Soviets control roughly half of the city, with the other half roughly being split up between Britain, France, and America. Now we're going to go through the long-term and the short-term causes of the Berlin blockade and airlift. We've got another sheet on Schoology that you guys might want to be filling in, or you can just be using some lined paper. So, long-term causes should be fairly familiar based on everything you've learnt about them so far. Stalin doesn't like West Berlin because he doesn't like West Germany, because he doesn't like Germany full stop. Germany is seen as a terrifying prospect for Stalin and the Soviet Union. They've invaded Russia twice in the last 50 years, so they wanted to make sure that Germany was crippled so it could never do it again. But the Westerners, Britain, France, and America, wanted Germany to get back up on its feet. That means that they were plugging in millions and millions of dollars in order to get West Germany looking good and West Berlin in East Germany looking good as well. As a result, West Berlin was seen as a window into the West. An East Berliner and a West Berliner might do the same job, but they would get paid very different wages and their experience of life would be very different as well. The East Berliner would get paid less, the consumer goods that he could buy or the clothes that he could buy would not be as good, and he could walk over to West Berlin and see his friend or his cousin or his brother doing the same job and getting a much better life experience. This damages Stalin's propaganda about the value of communism. In terms of the British and American point of view, Truman in particular refused to let West Berlin fall to communism. It's kind of the reverse point of that window to the West. He saw it as a beacon of democracy behind the Iron Curtain. So while Stalin was concerned that West Berlin was advertising capitalism, obviously capitalist Truman loved the fact there was advertising capitalism. The West also used West Berlin as a spy centre. It was more difficult to get a spy into East Europe from West Europe. But if you send your spies into West Berlin, it's going to be easier for them just to cross the street into East Berlin and then get a train ticket or a car into another part of East Europe. And more generally, we already know about Truman's Truman Doctrine. He's the president that made it clear that the West, or at least America specifically, would contain the spread of communism. Therefore, he would refuse to let even one street in West Berlin turn communist if he could help it. Now we're going to look at these short-term causes of tension. These are things which we haven't specifically covered, although there are a few more familiar ideas. Last lesson we learned about Marshall Aid or Marshall Plan. This was the economic bribe to countries so that they didn't turn communist. We know that West Germany, and therefore West Berlin, received millions and millions of dollars to help rebuild its economy. Now, on top of that, Britain, France and America start directly going against the Yalta and Potsdam agreements. It starts out with Britain and America joining their zones into bizonia, think of a bicycle. A few months later, France joins into trizonia, think of a triangle. They go one step further, and this is the trigger that starts off the Berlin Blockade. On the 20th of June 1948, they announced that there will be a single unified currency in this trizonia. So they've just made up a new type of money which would not be compatible. You wouldn't be able to exchange it in the Eastern Soviet style. Just 4 days later, Stalin will blockade West Berlin. He sees this as breaking the Potsdam Agreement for joint decisions about Germany, and it absolutely was. He was also concerned that the Western Allies were trying to reunite Germany into a clear capitalist country. The whole point of splitting Germany into 4 regions had been that no group agreement could be made. But now 3 of those groups, Britain, France and America, were joining themselves at the expense of the Soviet-controlled Germany. Again, that is another key agreement of Potsdam which the West were breaking. Now, we already know, or at least I've already told you, what Stalin does. He does blockade, but I haven't gone into exactly what that might entail. So pause the video and think about how might Stalin make a stand. So if you already know about the blockade, think about how Truman might respond. If you haven't learned anything about this yet, think about what could he do to try and show the West that he won't take this lying down. So, using your textbook, you need page 27 to briefly describe the events of the Berlin Airlift. I'm going to give a little bit of a summary, then you should pause the video and go to the textbook and make more notes. So Stalin has a plan. He wants to starve out West Berlin. Obviously, he can't force West Berliners to choose communism unless he forces them without directly forcing them. In other words, he can't at gunpoint make them sign on the dotted line, but he can make their lives so terrible that they willingly choose communism. So without warning, on the 24th of June 1948, he blockades, or he blocks off, or he stops every road, every train track and every canal or riverway going into West Berlin. In other words, he's going to stop all supplies from going in. He thought that within a few weeks, West Berliners would be starved, they'll have run out of coal for fuel, and they'll be begging to join communism. But there is one thing he didn't count on. The idea of using an airlift, of just dropping in supplies via airports. The reason he couldn't stop this is that he didn't want to break the Potsdam Agreement himself. And in the Potsdam Agreement, he had specifically allowed 3 air corridors going into West Berlin. In other words, there was nothing to stop Britain, France and America flying their planes through these air corridors. If they went outside of it, technically, they were in a foreign country without permission. But because the Potsdam Agreement had specifically allowed these corridors, Stalin couldn't stop them without himself breaking the Potsdam Agreement. And there's this weird propaganda victory going on, or at least propaganda war going on. Stalin rightly was angry that Britain, France and America were breaking the Potsdam Agreement. But if he himself broke it by somehow blocking off these air corridors, then he would be no better. And you're going to see this time and time again in the Cold War, where either side could make a move which might have been successful, it might have achieved the objective, but it would have failed the overall objective of winning the propaganda war in the Cold War. Now, looking through page 27, there's loads and loads of precise factual detail. There's no way you're ever going to remember all of them, and there's no way you're ever going to need all of them. But there's a couple of points which I'm going to talk about again and again, just because I think they're easier to remember. So to give you an idea of the scale of how successful the airlift was, bringing in every single type of supply that Berliners need to survive the airlift, At its height, every 90 seconds a plane was landing in West Berlin. That gives you an idea of how many planes, how much money, how much supplies are coming into the city at any one time. Obviously, there is tension. Obviously, there are arguments. Many pilots will be in severe danger because Stalin will be flying Soviet planes through those corridors, or he'll put up weather balloons, basically massive blimps, to try and obstruct it. But he won't order planes to shoot them down. That's clearly aggressive. That's clearly an act of war. But if the pilots crash because of other reasons, then he can chalk that up to a simple misunderstanding or bad communication or bad weather. So several pilots do die in the crash, but importantly, they're not directly killed by any Soviet soldier. Stalin was assured by his military advisors that an airlift wouldn't work. A similar thing had been tried by the Nazis during World War II. Stalingrad, a city named after Stalin, had been blockaded by the Soviets to keep the German soldiers in and starve them out. And Hitler had been assured by his German Air Force that they could support the soldiers. But this was a completely different scenario. Germany didn't have enough airplanes, whereas Britain, France, America, and all of their allies did. And more importantly, the German airplanes were getting shot down every single second of every single day. So Stalin was misled into thinking that the airlift could never work. To be fair, even at its start, Truman didn't think that the airlift wouldn't work forever. He saw it as a delaying tactic. But as the negotiations broke down, as it made it clear that the airlift would have to be keep happening, then the airlift supplies increased, the amount of planes increased, and after nearly a year, the airlift is finally taken off. It's only taken off because Stalin realizes that he cannot win. Now, we're going to do something slightly different from previous lessons. We're going to play a game of propaganda bingo. Now, I'm going to leave a link in the description of a British newsreel. Newsreels aren't really a thing anymore. These are how people would get video news before television. So obviously they could always read newspapers, but if they wanted to see footage of dramatic things, they couldn't just switch on the newspaper in their own home. They would go to a theatre. And sometimes they'd go to see these newsreels specifically, or sometimes they'd just be before or after the film that they're seeing. Now, this is a bit of British propaganda. This is the British trying to advertise how amazing they were at the Berlin Airlift. So on a piece of scrap paper, can you draw a grid of 3 by 3 and try and come up with 9 things you think will be in this propaganda from the British point of view? So think about what sorts of people will be shown, what they will be doing, what you might hear, specifically the types of music, the mood of the people, and think what you won't see. So I'll tell you right now, you will not see Stalin. And try and think about why that might be. A couple of suggestions here. Feel free to come up with your own. So pause the video now, go and watch that propaganda video and think, have I been able to guess or predict what sorts of things the British want the British public to see? So, looking at my list, all of the red ones are ones which you wouldn't see. And if you think all of them are negative, some of you might have thought, evil-looking Soviet soldiers, I'll definitely put that in there. But from the British point of view, this isn't the propaganda they want in this specific video. There were definitely other examples of evil-looking soldiers in British propaganda. We'll see one when we look at the Berlin Wall about 10 years after this. But in this specific video, they want to show that the British, French, and American and many other countries are triumphing, are succeeding. They want one clear message. So if you have the positive British, French, and Americans and the evil Soviets, the message gets mixed. It's always worth remembering that propaganda is used by both sides all the time throughout the Cold War. There is a constant propaganda battle going on. So you can't just think of propaganda as always being used by the communists. The Democrats and the capitalists are at it as well, but obviously for a better reason. So now we need to have a look at the results of the Berlin blockade and airlift. So for that you need to turn to page 28. As before, we'll go through a couple of the key points, but make sure you've got down at least 5 bullet points with some precise factual detail. Now, in terms of the propaganda victory for the West, it's clearly shown that Stalin wasn't the man of steel that many people presumed him to be. He tried to starve out West Berlin and he had failed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that for decades afterwards, he was seen as a failure in the East, because the Soviet propaganda was so strong that they could just lie about the entire reason for the blockade. So if you ever look at source Q on page 28, it shows that in a 1977 record, so 3 decades later, the Soviets are lying about why Stalin had done it. Stalin had done the blockade to try and convince or force West Berlin to turn communist, but they've rewritten history here and said that actually Stalin used the blockade to stop a war from happening in Berlin, to try and punish the West Berliners so that the Western countries like America would back down. So he's completely rewritten history. As to how much this is believed by your average Soviet person, that's kind of hard to judge, because it'd be very hard to get records of Soviet people specifically saying, I know this to be a lie. Because if they've written it down, or if they've said it, it's very possible that the Soviet secret police would end up taking them out of their beds in the middle of the night. For the Western propaganda, have a quick look at source O. We've got an image of one of the American pilots, a man called Gale Halvorson. He has a better nickname called Uncle Wiggly Wings, and is another great propaganda example for the West. He had been flying in American supplies regularly when this time he saw, just outside the airfield, some German children. And he said, here's some gum. Make sure you share it amongst yourselves, and if you're really good about it, I'll give you some tomorrow as well. So he kept on doing this and kept on doing this until he got to the point where he thought, well, there's so many children here. Why don't I drop them out? Why don't I drop the sweets out of the plane using little handkerchiefs as parachutes? Obviously, there were so many different planes coming in. The way that the children would know is that he would literally wiggle the wings of his plane. Soon, loads of other pilots were doing it as well. So it's a great propaganda victory. Not only are they feeding West Berlin, but they're giving chocolate to starving Berlin children. Wider consequences of the Berlin blockade and airlift are that there is now a clear divide between East and West Germany. Obviously, West Berlin is still in East Germany, but because the blockade is lifted, those regular transport links through trains, cars and canals or rivers are maintained, so they don't need to keep shipping in supplies by air. We've talked about East and West Germany before, but you shouldn't really call them East or West Germany before this point. They were Allied areas of occupation or Allied zones of occupation. But the example is not going to care too much if you call it West Germany before 1949. On the screen, we've got the official flags of these countries once they are established and their official names. If you look at the first one, the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR, you'd think, I know straight away that's West Germany, but it is actually East. The weird thing is, communists will often use democracy or democratic in a weird way. When we say democratic, we mean the people get to vote for and choose the government, they get to choose their leader. But obviously there's no true elections in a communist country. So when a communist says democratic, they don't mean that the people are choosing, they mean that the country is representing the people. It's one of those fundamental, one of those basic ideas about communism, that the country should be controlled by the government and the government should do everything for the people rather than for private profit or anything like that. Below that, we've got the Federal German Republic, or the FRG. I'm never going to use these titles again, but you should make sure that they are in the back of your mind, because the exam board might try to trip you up, and rather than just say West Germany, they'll give the correct title of Federal German Republic. Now we've got some more stretching challenges to finish off the lesson. Can you please make sure you're doing at least one of these? Now, if you think about why the Berlin blockade started, obviously it was a massive escalation on Stalin's part to try and starve out, literally starve millions of people either to death or communism. But he only did it because Britain, France and America were directly going against Potsdam agreements or making joint decisions for Germany. So if they hadn't have formed Bisonia, then Trisonia, and then triggered Stalin with the Deutschmark, the blockade would not have happened, or at least it would not have happened in 1948 to 1949. So think about which side is more responsible for creating tensions there. We've got that quote which we've started the lesson with, again attributed to Vladimir Lenin. I don't know whether he actually said it or not. He who controls Berlin controls Germany. He who controls Germany controls Europe. I'd strongly recommend writing that down and coming back to it as we go through the rest of the Cold War, because there'll be two more major flashpoints: the creation of the Berlin Wall in 1961 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and later German reunification. Finally, we've got an optional practice question which you guys might want to do and hand in to your teacher. Question 1, explain two consequences of the Berlin crisis 1948 to 1949. So the structure is exactly the same as the previous exam practice that you've done, so it'd be worth seeing how well you guys can do without any input from me whatsoever. So that's been our lesson on how did post-war Berlin decide the fate of Europe. One final thing I'd like you to do is write one sentence to directly answer that question and think, actually, have I understood why Berlin was so important and why has that set up large parts of the Cold War, or at least set up the rest of the Cold War in Europe?